Hello, and I am back with White Rage. That's better. The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide. A couple weeks ago, we started reading this book, and we made it about halfway through the first chapter. We made it about halfway through because, we're not just reading this out loud, we're discussing what we come across as well. And we had a lot to discuss with that first part. So we're going to pick back up. If you're reading along with me, I am on page 14, about halfway down. I'm going to start the second paragraph, or essentially the third paragraph again, to get everybody kind of caught up. The situation only worsened with the presidency of the man who stepped in after Lincoln's assassination. To be sure, during the war, Andrew Johnson, a Tennessee Democrat, had blasted the Confederate leadership and plantation owners as traitors who must be punished and impoverished. But his resentment was rooted in the class envy of an embittered man who had grown up achingly poor, hardscrabble, and illiterate, utterly unlike the Southern gentry who had challenged the Union. Johnson's antipathy, did not translate into support for black equality or the abolitionist whom he disdained. Indeed, the contempt this sometime slave owner felt for black people was palpable. This is what we're picking up new. Addressing a regiment of African American soldiers who had just returned from a tour of duty in October 1865, the president lectured them. Freedom is not simply the principle to live in idleness, he chided the men. Liberty does not mean merely to resort to the low saloons and other places of disreputable character. Never mind that these were men in uniform, men who had honorably served the United States. In this president's estimation, blacks, despite years of service to the nation and a willingness to put their lives on the line, 40,000 had died during the war, were just immoral, drunken sluggards. How then could the epic violence that had consumed the United States have been about the nation recognizing the very humanity and citizenship of these beings? The new president, just like Lincoln, had convinced himself instead that the Civil War was only about preserving the Union. No more, no less. And therefore he set about stitching the rebel South back into the fabric of the nation. The Confederate flag, but it's about heritage. First, within weeks after taking office, Johnson pardoned scores of former Confederates, ignoring Congress's 1862 ironclad test oath that expressly forbade him to do so. Does that sound familiar? A man in office doing something that he was not supposed to? Okay. And handed out full amnesty to thousands whom just the year before he had called guerrillas and cutthroats and traitors who ought to be hung. Beneficiaries of his largesse included the head of the Confederate Army, Robert E. Lee, and even CSA Vice President Alexander Stephens. Even more shocking, given Johnson's decades-long resentment against and vilification of the damnable aristocracy, giving myself grace. His generosity and forgiveness extended to the plantation owners themselves. Still, there was hope of progress. In March 1865, Congress created an organization, the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, commonly known as a Freedmen's Bureau, which had a range of responsibilities, including the reallocation of abandoned Southern land to the newly emancipated. The Bureau's charge was to lease 40-acre parcels that would provide economic self-sufficiency to a people who had endured hundreds of years of unpaid toil. The 40-acre and a mule. Keep that in your mind because that's what we're talking about, or what we're reading about. Already in January 1865, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman had issued Special Field Order Number 15, which to take some of the pressure off of his army as thousands of slaves eagerly fled their plantations and trailed behind his troops, reserved coastal land in Georgia and South Carolina for black settlement. Less than a year after he issued the order, 40,000 former slaves had begun to work 400,000 acres of this land. Then in July of the same year, the head of the Freedmen's Bureau, General Oliver O. Howard, issued Circular 13, fully authorizing the lease of 40-acre plots from abandoned plantations to the newly freed families. Howard was neither a great administrator nor a great man, noted W.E.B. Du Bois, but he was a good man. He was sympathetic and humane, and tried with endless application and desperate sacrifice to do a hard, thankless duty. Howard made clear that whatever amnesty President Johnson may have bestowed on Southern rebels did not extend to abandoned or confiscated property. Johnson, however, immediately rescinded Howard's order, commanding the army to throw tens of thousands of freed people off the land and reinstall the plantation owners. While this could have become while this could have come from a simple ideological aversion to land redistribution, this was not the case. And for Johnson, not the issue. Who received it was. It was not about the land. It was not the redistribution of the land. It was about who was going to receive the land. Beginning in 1843, when he was first elected to the U.S. Congress, and over the next 19 years, Johnson had championed the Homestead Act, which would give, not lease, 160 acres in the West to citizens who were without money, meaning poor whites. The intended beneficiaries were clear because from 1843 through 1862, when the law was finally passed, most African Americans were not citizens and therefore, regardless of how impoverished, were ineligible, doggedly pushing back on those who had argued that a land giveaway program was unfair to those who had actually saved their hard-earned dollars and purchased their plots. He made no apologies for standing by the poor man and getting him a home that he could call his. Nor was it just acreage out west that Johnson eyed. In 1864, 2 years after the Homestead Act passed, he advocated taking the plantation owners' land as well, distributing it to free, industrious, and honest farmers, which again was Johnson's way of helping poor whites whose opportunities he felt had been denied and whose chances had been thwarted by the enslaved and masters alike. In fact, he reveled in the charge that he was too much of the poor man's friend. But even his core constituency, first impoverished under the old plantocracy and then treated as cannon fodder, became readily expendable when it seemed that the only way to keep blacks as labor without rights was to reinstate the leadership of the old Confederacy. All of this creativity to keep black people from being free and having rights, all of this creativity, but nothing for the actual freeing of black people. Johnson's rash of pardons had the desired effect. The new congressional delegation looked hauntingly like those from the Old South. CSA Vice President Stevens and cabinet officers, as well as 10 Confederate generals, a number of colonels, and nearly 60 Confederate Congress representatives were ready to be ensconced once again in the nation's capital. The reigning leaders of the Confederacy, who had rightfully expected to be tried and hung as traitors, now were not only poised to sail back into power in the federal government, but also, given Johnson's amnesty, allowed to regain control of their states, and as a consequence of the millions of the newly emancipated and landless black people there. As he welcomed one niggers will catch hell state after the next back into the Union with no mention whatsoever of black voting rights and thus no political protection, he effectively laid the groundwork for mass murder. One of the president's emissaries, Carl Schurz, recoiled as he traveled through the South and gathered reports of African American women who had been scalped, had their ears cut off, or had been thrown into a river and drowned amid chants for them to swim to the damned Yankees. Young black boys and men were routinely stabbed, clubbed, and shot. Some were even chained to a tree and burned to death. In what can only be described as a travelogue of death, as he went from county to county, state to state, he conveyed the sickening, unbearable stench of decomposing black bodies hanging from limbs, rotting in ditches, and clogging the roadways. White Southerners, it was obvious, had unleashed a reign of terror and anti-black violence that had reached staggering proportions. Many urged the president to strengthen the federal presence in the South. Johnson refused, choosing instead to preside over this slow-motioned genocide. The lack of a vigorous, or for that matter, any response only further encouraged white Southerners who recognized that they now had a friend in the White House. who recognized that they now had a friend in the White House. A lot of people have said that having Donald Trump in the White House emboldened a lot of people to say the things that they've been feeling and thinking, and their expressions or their thoughts about Black people, Indigenous people, and other people of color. He emboldened them to be public with it, to be outright with it, to hold nothing back. Everything that we are experiencing now is a continuation of what happened historically. Very little that you see right now is new. So when people say this got so bad in 2016, no, it just got louder. The people now saw their friend in the White House in Donald Trump are just like the Southerners who saw their friend in the White House with Andrew Johnson. One former cabinet member in the Confederacy later admitted that the white South was so devastated and demoralized, it would have accepted almost any of the North's terms. But once Johnson held up before us the hope of a white man's government, it led us to set aside Negro suffrage and to resist Northern plans to improve the condition of the freedmen. Thus emboldened, Virginia's rebellion tainted leaders planned to accomplish with votes what they had failed to accomplish with bayonets. Like a hydra, white supremacist regimes sprang out of Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and the other states of a newly resurgent South. As they drafted their new constitutions, the delegates were defiant, dismissive of any supposed federal authority, and ready to reinsert and reimpose white supremacy as if the abolition of slavery and the Civil War had never happened. They praised their newfound ally on Pennsylvania Avenue, who saw things that seemed much as they did. The delegates at Louisiana's Constitutional Conference in October 1865 were so confident in the president's support and their reclaimed power that they resolved, we hold this to be a government of white people, made and to be perpetrated for the exclusive benefit of the white race. And in accordance with the constant adjudication of the United States Supreme Court, specifically the infamous Dred Scott decision of 1856, wherein Chief Justice Roger B. Taney had stated explicitly that Black people have no rights which the white man is bound to respect. The Louisiana delegates concluded that people of African descent cannot be considered as citizens of the United States. People of African descent cannot be considered citizens of the United States. The very people that built this country, the very people that had worked themselves to the bones, were not citizens of the United States after being kidnapped and brought here. In this reconstruction of the Reconstruction, with the reassertation of Dred Scott, the exclusion of Blacks from the ballot box, and the recession of 40 acres and a mule, African Americans now had neither citizenship, the vote, nor land. Johnson, who saw Black empowerment as a nightmare, insisted, "This is a country for white men, and by God, as long as I'm president, it shall be a government for white men." Therefore, Louisiana's declaration that people of African descent cannot be considered citizens of the United States aligned perfectly with Johnson's. One Georgia plantation owner agreed, as he asserted that white Southerners now had the right and power to govern overpopulation in our own way. And as Louisiana emphasized, that meant getting things back as near to slavery as possible. Mississippi showed the way. In the fall of 1865, the state passed a series of laws targeted and applicable only to African Americans, free and newly emancipated, that undercut any chance or hope for civil rights, economic independence, or even the reestablishment of families that had been ripped apart by slavery. As noted by Du Bois, the notorious Black codes were an astonishing affront to emancipation and made plain and indisputable the attempt on the part of the Southern states to make Negroes slaves in everything but name. The codes required that Blacks sign annual labor contracts with plantation, mill, or mine owners. If African Americans refused or could show no proof of gainful employment, they would be charged with vagrancy and put on the auction block, with their labor sold to the highest bidder. With their labor sold. So they were put into positions where they could not have land, had to struggle to find jobs, had to sign over contracts, essentially signing over their lives and any decisions that they had, which was very few. And if they didn't do that, then they would be up for sale. The supposed contract was beyond binding. It was more like a shackle. For African Americans were forbidden to seek better wages and working conditions with another employer. No matter how intolerable the working conditions, if they left the plantation, lumber camp, or mine, they would be jailed and auctioned off. They were trapped. Self-sufficiency itself was illegal, as blacks couldn't hold any other employment besides laborer or domestic unless they had the written consent of the mayor or judge, and were also banned from hunting and fishing, and thus denied the means even to starve off hunger. More galling yet was a provision whereby black children who had been sold before the war and hadn't yet reunited with their parents were to be apprenticed off, with the former masters having the first right to their labor. Finally, the penalty for defiance, insulting gestures, and inappropriate behavior, the black codes made clear, was a no holds barred whipping, meaning that on top of the demoralization of black people, on top of the dehumanization of black people, on top of the stripping of everything that made black people human, they weren't allowed to express their frustration at all. They had to take it all with a smile on their face, with a yes, sir, no, sir, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. Mississippi's success in reinscribing slavery by another name was undeniable. 9 of the other former Confederate states quickly copied the Black Codes, sometimes verbatim. These laws, despite their draconian nature, were not the work of extreme secessionists. Some of the South's most respected judges, attorneys, and planters crafted the Black Codes. From the cool marble halls of the state houses, white opposition had done its job with the mere stroke of a pen. If you call this freedom, wrote one black veteran, what do you call slavery? Not even Union General and future President Ulysses S. Grant saw anything wrong. Under Florida's Black Codes, disobedience or impudence was a form of vagrancy, and a vagrant could be whipped. In Louisiana, Black adults had to sign labor contracts within the first 10 days of each year that committed them and their children to work on a plantation. In North Carolina, orphans were sent to work for the former masters of their families rather than allowing them to live with grandparents or other relatives. But Grant, despite all brutal evidence to the contrary, was convinced that white Southerners had adjusted well to losing the Civil War. If African Americans resisted and complained bitterly about the Black Codes, this meant only that the Freedmen's Bureau was encouraging unrealistic expectations among the former slaves. Grant did not attribute the turmoil in the South to the incredible levels of violence unleashed on the newly freed or to the barbaric Black Codes to which they were now subject. General Howard's staff, he felt, must be the source of the problem. Bureau and federal oversight were, in Grant's mind, unnecessary, even harmful. One Philadelphia newspaper, a hair more realistic, acknowledged the Odysseusness of the Black Codes. Still, the article continued, the codes were necessary. Perhaps the form they took was a touch too severe, but the Black Codes, it argued, were not about trying to reestablish slavery. The Southern states just wanted to stop vagrancy and put an end to the undeniable evilness of idleness and pauperism arising from the sudden emancipation of so many slaves. By compelling them to work, the argument went, this measure prevented the newly freed from becoming a burden upon society for just wanting to exist, for just wanting to live, for just having the right to walk down the street and breathe. What the paper failed to recognize was that Black people's willingness to work had never been the problem. What the paper failed to recognize was that Black people's willingness to work had never been the problem. Having to work for free under backbreaking conditions, and the threat of the lash was a real issue. Having to work for free under backbreaking conditions and the threat of the lash was a real issue. Nor did Johnson's policies or the Black Codes ensure that African Americans would not be a burden upon society. If anything, they guaranteed the opposite. Blacks were denied access to land, banned from hunting and fishing, and forbidden to work independently using skills honed and developed while enslaved, such as blacksmithing. Under such conditions, self-sufficiency could have never been achieved. Right now, there's a discussion, particularly Ron DeSantis in Florida, who is convinced that slavery was a good thing, that is convinced that slavery taught Black people skills and a trade that would benefit us in the long run. But as you can see, all of those skills that were acquired were used for white men and white people and not allowed to be used independently. It didn't matter how many skills were acquired. It didn't matter how many trades were mastered. They were only allowed to be used for white people. So there is in no way that that can be considered a benefit to Black people if they weren't allowed to use them as a means of self-sufficiency. The bottom line was that the Black economic independence was an anathema to a power structure that depended on cheap, exploitable, rightless labor and required Black subordination. But instead of honing in on this fundamental reality, the Philadelphia newspaper simply bemoaned the unforeseen and unfortunate consequences of the Black Codes for whites, complaining that since planters refused to pay wages at all to Blacks due to the landowners' claims that Negroes are so lazy as not to be worth paying, there's a downward pressure on overall wages that left poor whites unable to find work that provided enough to keep soul and body together. And yet, even when the constituency for whom Andrew Johnson swore he served and got caught up in the blowback of these ruthless laws, he did not lift a finger to stop it. As another article in the paper asserted, the South was in much better shape than could have been expected, and this was because of the president's policies, which were worthy of our admiration. Johnson understood, the paper contended, that the war was for the Union, and the Union had been restored beyond our most sanguine expectations. The president then was to be commended for a job well done. I'm going to go back to this part real quick. Instead of honing in on the fundamental reality of what was going on against Black people, the Philadelphia newspaper simply bemoaned the unforeseen and unfortunate consequences of the Black Codes for whites. These states created these Black Codes to keep Black people in as close to slavery as possible. But those codes and the consequences of those codes were a problem for white people. Okay. Andrew Johnson could not have agreed more. His message to Congress in December 1865 had that same upbeat, triumphed cadence. The war was over. The South was repentant. New governments had been formed. The federal government, he concluded, had done what it had set out to do and done it beautifully. He had heard some rumblings about voting and civil rights for the freed people, but any lingering questions about rights, despite the enforcement clause in the 13th Amendment, Johnson felt were matter for the states. This congratulatory rose-colored vision of the State of the Union ignored the brutal conditions that greeted 4 million people by the war's end. Johnson dismissed the numerous reports of mutilated Black bodies piled up like logs, did not hear the incessant cracks of the whips tearing into Black flesh, and found in the draconian Black Codes that reinstalled slavery by another name nothing but progress. How stunning, too, that such a prideful, stubborn man could swallow his dignity over and over again when the states he had just welcomed back into the fold defied even the very low standards he had set to rejoin the United States of America. South Carolina ratified the 13th Amendment only after the state had attached the Declaration with its own series of if, then, but clauses, nullifying any federal right to enforce the anti-slavery provision. To make its point perfectly clear, the state also refused to renounce its Articles of Secession. Louisiana and Alabama attached their own addendum addenda negating congressional authority over the state status of slavery within their borders. Florida held out against ratification until nearly the bitter end, December 28th, 1865, and had to do it again in 1868. Texas held out even longer, 1870. Mississippi, whose governor, a Confederate general, pardoned 3 days after winning the gubernatorial election, just flat out refused to ratify the amendment. Indeed, such was Mississippi's obstinacy that it delayed ratification of the 13th Amendment until 2013. Indeed, such was Mississippi's obstinacy that it delayed ratification of the 13th Amendment until 2013, 10 years ago. But despite at least half the old Confederacy mocking and treating contemptuously hit his olive branch, Johnson was pleased with what he had done. Not only had the Union been preserved, but also the ratification of the 13th Amendment, no matter how half-hearted or tarnished, meant that the existence of chattel slavery would never threaten the sanctity of the nation again. As the president surveyed all that he had accomplished, he was satisfied. He simply could not fathom that Northern Republicans, concerned about the complete deprivation of rights for freed people, would criticize or try to undo what he had so painstakingly stitched together. I thought we would make it through chapter 1, but let's go ahead and pause there. Like I discussed, or like we said before, nothing that we're experiencing today is anything new. It is from the playbook of the beginning of time of this country, the establishment of this country, from when this country was built on the backs of Black Americans. The possibility of Black Americans having rights, the possibility of Black people, because at this time they weren't allowed to be citizens, the possibility of, or the mere thought of Black people having rights scared white people so much that they did everything they could to keep them still within slavery. And I believe that that concern comes because they were concerned about the retaliation of Black people and what they would do upon being freed, which, I mean, makes sense based off of how they treated Black people. But honestly, what you can see from this, Black people just wanted to be able to live, to be able to provide for their families, to be able to be reunited with their families. Their children had been stripped from them. All Black people have ever wanted was to just be able to live, have access to things that allow us to have a livable life, meaning being able to provide for our families, being able to work and bring money into our homes. That is all that has ever been wanted. And that is the largest threat to white supremacists. That is the largest threat to the thought of whiteness that considers them above Black people. Thank you for going through this with me. Again, this was another heavy portion. Sit with this. Sit with what you've heard. Sit with what you've read with me, and think about how you are seeing today what we just read in this part of chapter 1. I appreciate you being with me here today. I will be back with you soon to continue chapter 1 of White Rage. Again, it is by Carol Anderson. White Rage: The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide. It's a heavy book. I knew it was going to be a heavy book. We're going to get through it. But this is such an eye-opening moment to realize that history is not repeating itself. It is just continuing the way it started. I will see you all soon. Y'all make sure to stay hydrated and be gentle with yourselves after reading this book.